The grand hall of the International Peace Summit shimmered with chandeliers, cameras, and the restless murmurs of the world's most powerful leaders. Every seat was taken: presidents, diplomats, generals, and journalists from across the globe. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken grievances, unfulfilled promises, and the gnawing fear of a world inching closer to chaos. At the center of it all, two men locked eyes: President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso and Donald Trump, the former US president who still commanded immense influence over Western policy. The tension between them was palpable, almost physical, like a storm brewing on the horizon. For months, the news had been dominated by images of destruction in Gaza, families displaced, children buried beneath rubble, hospitals overwhelmed. The Global South had raised its voice repeatedly, demanding justice. But the Western Alliance, led by Washington, stood firm in its support for Netanyahu's government. And now, in this historic gathering, silence hovered over the chamber, waiting for someone, anyone, to speak the truth. That someone was Ibrahim Traoré. He rose from his seat slowly, his military uniform gleaming under the spotlights. The whispers ceased. Cameras turned. Every eye followed him as he stepped toward the microphone at the center of the hall. His movements carried both the calmness of a soldier and the urgency of a man carrying the burden of his people's voice. Then, with a steady gaze fixed on Trump, Traoré's voice boomed across the chamber. "Stop backing Netanyahu. End the bloodshed." The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. They were not carefully polished diplomatic phrases. They were not veiled suggestions wrapped in politeness. They were raw, direct, and impossible to ignore. A ripple went through the crowd. Some gasped. Others looked down, pretending to be absorbed in their notes. But no one could deny what had just been spoken. Trump leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his face tightening. He had never been a man who tolerated public defiance. And yet, in that moment, he remained silent. The weight of Traoré's words pressed down on him, and on every leader in that room. Traoré continued, his voice rising with conviction. For decades, Africa has watched the hypocrisy of Western diplomacy. You preach peace, yet you fund war. You call for freedom, yet you arm oppression. And when innocent blood is spilled in Gaza, you turn away. But today, I will not turn away. Africa will not turn away. His words were met with stunned silence. The leaders of Europe shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some whispered to their aides, others tapped nervously on their phones. But none dared to interrupt him. For the first time, the chamber felt less like a summit and more like a trial, and the Western Alliance sat in the defendant's chair. Trump finally leaned forward, his trademark smirk curling at the edges of his lips. "Mr. Traoré," he said slowly the microphone, amplifying every syllable, "you think you can lecture the United States? You think Burkina Faso has the power to dictate global policy?" There was laughter from a corner of the room, forced, nervous laughter from those who always clung to Washington's orbit. But Traoré didn't flinch. His gaze remained locked on Trump. "This is not about power," he replied firmly. "It is about humanity. And humanity is greater than your alliances, greater than your politics, greater than the arrogance that blinds you to the cries of the children in Gaza." The hall fell into silence once again. Even Trump's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of unease. The cameras zoomed in on his face, capturing the rare moment when he seemed genuinely unsettled. Traoré pressed on. "You may ignore me today. You may dismiss Africa's voice. But history will not dismiss the truth. And the truth is this: every bomb you fund, every bullet you supply, every life lost under your silence, it will stain your legacy forever." His words struck like thunder. Some leaders began clapping hesitantly, then more joined, until the sound of applause filled the chamber. It wasn't universal, but it was powerful enough to shatter the wall of silence that had protected the Western Bloc for so long. Trump's jaw tightened. He raised his hand as if to respond, but then let it drop, perhaps realizing that anything he said might only fuel the fire Traoré had ignited. Instead, he leaned back again, muttering something under his breath that the microphones didn't catch. The summit would continue, with speeches about trade, climate change, and security. But everyone knew that the defining moment had already passed. It was not in the carefully drafted agreements or the photo ops. It was in the voice of one African leader daring to speak truth to power. Later that night, news outlets across the globe replayed the clip. Social media exploded with hashtags. Hashtag Traoré vs Trump. Hashtag Voice for Gaza. Hashtag Africa Speaks. Millions watched as Traoré stood tall, his words echoing far beyond the walls of that chamber. To some, he was reckless. To others, he was a hero. But to all, he was unforgettable. And as dawn broke over the cities of Gaza, where families clung to life amid rubble and despair, perhaps, just perhaps, his words carried a glimmer of hope. For the first time in years, the silence had been broken.